Press 1 if you can hear us. Awesome. We are also live broadcasting this on Google Hangout, and it'll record as a YouTube video that hopefully we'll have audio on this time. You know Mimi, who's sitting in front of the camera. She's our legal director.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Legal director, and I'm working on voter registration issues in the state. We're going to give folks about 2 minutes to finish hopping on, and then we're going to go ahead and start the call. In the meantime, I'm going to put everyone's hands down on our system. So that means if you have any initial questions about how to access the video, we can go over that now. You can press 1, and we can maybe try to get you there in the next like 2 minutes. Cool. Looks like nobody's having any issues. Two minutes.
It's amazing to see myself in surround sound, surround vision.
Surround vision. What? It usually gives us a view count. Okay. All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to hand it over to Mimi.
All right. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. I want to go through first very quickly an overview of the voter protection program. I think many of you are quite familiar with this, but just to make sure. And secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the resources already available to you. Third, I want to share some very exciting news, which is that the Secretary of State has a new voter registration form that's available online. We'll get to that in a second. And then finally, I'll open it up for questions and answers. And some of you already submitted questions earlier today. I'll answer those first, and then we'll get some more questions in there. So without further ado, let's start by talking about the voter protection program overall. So as you might know, we have 3 main goals in 2015. The first is to support the critical voter registration work that all of you are doing out in the field. The second is to continue researching suppressive election laws and practices and figure out ways to remedy the problems that we identify. And third, we are continuing to monitor the elections, and we're doing that by putting lawyers at the polls for these local elections in 2015, and again, running our voter protection hotline, 1-844-TX-VOTES, which will be live throughout the voting period in the May election and again in November. And Danny will tell you more about the hotline as we get closer to that date. So today we are going to focus on the work that my program is doing and the work that we can be doing to best support your voter registration work out in the field. First, I wanted to highlight the materials already available. So on the Battleground Texas website and also in the volunteer portal that is available to you on the website, there are a couple of important resources. Number one, there is a short, maybe 4-minute video that stars me, again, if this podcast, I guess YouTube video, whatever it's called, is not enough. And that video goes through best practices for registering voters as a VDR. It also just goes through a basic overviews of the most important laws. So that's a really important thing to watch, to share with your volunteers. And, you know, even if you've seen it before and you haven't seen it for a while, to perhaps go back to, again, we took a lot of time in creating that, and we did our very best to point out the most important things you need to know. And that is available in English and in Spanish. We also have a series of Know Your Rights videos on the website and in the portal. And one is on voter registration itself, and others are on topics that you might get questions about when you're registering voters, including voting by mail, photo ID, and election day procedures. In addition, there is a one-pager do's and don'ts document. I think you're very familiar with that. And there is the voter registration agreement and sign-in, sign-out document. I hope you're all very familiar with this. It is critically important that every single voter registration drive begins and ends with volunteers signing in and signing out to the agreement form so that we know they've reviewed the rules they need to follow and that they are taking account of all of the forms they collect. And coming soon, although not available quite yet, there will be a place on the website for you to submit questions about voter registration and voting to me and to my team. And as soon as that's available, Danny will make sure that you know. But this is also really exciting. It's a way that I can make sure that myself and my team are as responsive as possible to questions from the field as they pop up. So that's what's available now, or available very soon. I next want to turn to the exciting news I mentioned before. So after several meetings with the Secretary of State and after repeated problems in 2014 with counties not giving us a sufficient number of voter registration forms, the Secretary of State's office has released a new form. It's available online in a PDF. It can be printed on regular paper that we can use to register voters. And this is an incredibly important tool for us. One, it means that we never again have to beg counties for forms and deal with the repercussions when they don't give us enough forms. It also means that we can standardize procedures so that, for instance, if you're running a voter registration drive at the Texas State Fair, that you're not worrying about 50 different forms. Instead, you can just make sure that you know where everybody is VDR'd, and you make sure that folks are only registering voters from counties where they're VDR'd, but they can be using the same form for everybody. This is really important. So election officials very recently sent out, the Secretary of State, I should say, sent out an advisory to all county election officials notifying them of this new voter registration form. And we will also share the advisory with you as well. But the key point is that the Secretary of State is expressly allowed to create a voter registration form like this. And the counties have been told that they need to accept this. So as we all know, the counties are not always as up to date on the voter registration laws as all of us, but we will give you the advisory, and you should rest assured that the counties need to accept this. And if there are any problems, you can notify me. So next, I just wanted to quickly show you the form. And so for those of you on, watching on video, not did it correctly. It looks like a standard voter registration form, but it has two receipts built into it. The bottom portion is meant to be cut off and given to the voter. The other receipt is what you fill out and you give it to the county officials with the rest of the form. So I've gotten a couple questions about the way that this is going to work in practice, and I just wanted to go over a couple points. One, you'll see that at the bottom of this new form, the registration receipt is what it's called, that is supposed to be cut off and given to voters. Here, way at the bottom, it has in the corner something called a receipt number. Now, this, as I best understand it, is not a mandatory field. It is instead created for organizations that do some sort of internal tracking. We don't do that because we have way too many people that it would make it impossible for us to date stamp every single one, at least for now. So you should rest assured that that is not a mandatory field. Now, if the counties, if you're working in a particular county and they want you to keep track of your receipts in some particular way, let me know, let Danny know, and we will talk about that. Everything else on the receipt should be fairly self-explanatory. It's you fill in the name of the voter, your own name, and if applicable, your VDR number. Again, we know not all counties have VDR numbers, so if your county doesn't have one, you would just write NA. Now, I also have gotten some questions about what the county will do when you turn these forms in. And again, this is all very, very new, so I cannot promise anything, but my best understanding is that the counties are not supposed to change their practices. So if you were used to getting a receipt in, let's say, Harris County, you should still get some sort of receipt from county officials when you turn in your form. And if that doesn't happen, or if there are other changes to the process that are concerning you, please let me know. Great. I think that is all I wanted to say about the form. And with that, we will go into some of the other questions that were submitted in advance. And then, as I said, allow plenty of time. I know that you guys have many other questions for you to ask those as well. So one question I received earlier today was about the status of registering to vote at DPS and whether there are possible lawsuits to force compliance or other actions that can be taken. Now, as I've told many of you, we received a lot of complaints from voters who had attempted to register at DPS and then were not on the voter rolls. This is very, very concerning. Under federal and state law, DPS has an obligation to register voters simultaneously with the voter getting a driver's license. And this also applies to all change of address information that's submitted to DPS. And as best we can tell, this is not consistently happening. And in fact, the Secretary of State itself has confirmed to us that they have received almost 5,000 complaints from voters in the last year about DPS voter registration practices. So, this is obviously a significant problem. Now, there are a couple ways to remedy it. I mean, we are going to make sure that the Secretary of State is aware of these problems that we've found out through our investigation. And then that's the first step, is hoping that they recognize that the law is very clear in this area and that they will need to make changes. Now, if no changes are made, then we will go from there. But I do ask that if any of you hear of people who have had problems registering at DPS, or if you yourself have witnessed any problems, or if you have any other information, please share it with me. I'd be very, very interested in knowing that. All right. Second question. So somebody asked about legislation that's pending related to voter registration and voter ID. Again, there is a lot of, there have been many, many bills filed. I think on this call, I'm just going to highlight the most exciting one, which is there is some bipartisan support right now for online voter registration. This is hugely important, of course. It would be, I mean, I don't need to tell you how critical that would be to our voter registration work. And the great thing is the election administrators have come together in support of this. So have many of the registrars, Republican and Democrat. And so there is hope that there's actual momentum to get this passed. But I certainly urge you, in your capacity as somebody who cares a lot about this, to keep an eye out for upcoming hearings and for other ways that you can speak out in favor. Battleground Texas is not in the practice of lobbying for specific bills. So at least at this point, we will not be doing any sort of formal lobbying in favor of that. That being said, you know, I certainly encourage you to keep an eye out and to talk to your friends, because it would be a really, I mean, not just important for the organization, but just important for the voters of Texas. So next question is, who is allowed to pick up blank forms and how many at one time? So there is no, well, first, there's absolutely no limit on how many forms you are permitted to have. And in fact, with this new PDF form, you can print off as many as your heart desires. Obviously, as we discussed before, sometimes county officials, because of resource limitations, will hesitate to give you a lot of forms, but hopefully we've eliminated a lot of those problems with the new PDF option. And as far as distribution of blank mail-in forms, that can also be done freely. And I know there are actually a couple of questions about this, but the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the highest federal court in Texas, and for a couple other states in the Southwest as well, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has said unequivocally that anybody can distribute blank mail-in forms. You don't have to be a VDR. You don't have to be a Texas citizen. You don't even have to be a U.S. citizen. So please keep that in mind. Now, this goes to another question that was submitted, which is, as VDRs, can we pick up completed mail-in forms and turn them into the county instead of mailing them in? Now, legally, as in the Texas election code, there is nothing to stop you from doing that, except that you need to have a receipt. That being said, it is Battleground Texas policy to abide by whatever the local practice is. And so many counties do not want to accept the mail-in forms because they don't have a receipt, and because it is confusing to their staff. This, again, is another reason why this new standard PDF form is so important, because it is just as easy now to access as the mail-in form. So hopefully there is really no reason that you would need to use mail-in forms. You know, again, best practice is definitely not to collect mail-in forms. They should go in the mail. If you ever end up in a situation where you have to collect mail-in forms, just make sure that there is a receipt. You know what? I think that is, I think I've gone through most of the questions. I'll note that there's two other very specific questions on here that I will address offline, because I think they're just so specific. I don't want to take up everybody else's time. So with that, let's open it up to you. I've been talking for a while, apologies. And let me know what additional questions you have.
Sure, so to submit questions, you can press 1 on your phone or type the questions in the Hangout box in the question section, and we'll just start taking questions from there. And we'll start with Gerald Haley in San Antonio. Gerald, go ahead.
Yeah. In San Antonio, a fertile ground for registered voters is we got via parking rights, okay? Basically,
right.
Made hubs, we talk about phone, but they've given us such a hard time out there, telling us to leave, even unimaginable stuff. So we can't register basically, and we want to find out what's the legality of that part. Can they do that?
Yep. And as we talked about the other day on the phone, unfortunately, rules about where you can canvass tend to be pretty complicated. As a general rule of thumb, you have a right to register voters in any sort of public space. I mean, there's a First Amendment right there. That being said, a lot of places like this park and ride are going to be what are technically called quasi-public spaces. which means they can have, and again, I'm going to use a legal term here, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And then that means that it's a matter of figuring out what those time, place, and manner restrictions are, whether they're reasonable, and how we can live with them. And I do know that I owe you an answer on this, and I'm actually going to make a note for myself to look into this. But another note for the future, these are excellent questions. I mean, questions involving, where can I canvass are really important. They've been coming up a lot because this is the first time that they're, this being the last 2 years of Battleground Texas's existence, it's been the first time that there have been widespread canvassers, political canvassers around Texas. And I want you to keep submitting these questions to me, but you should also know that it's going to take me a little bit of time to work through them because it actually requires me going back to kind of local regulations, sometimes talking to local officials to figure out their exact policies and how it's implemented.
Thanks, Gerald. We have one from John Young. John is asking, what information on a voter registration form is prohibited by law from being copied? I.e., what can we copy?
Right. So the first important thing is federal law is very, very clear, state law is very, very clear that you cannot photocopy a registration form. So you can never just wholesale photocopy a registration form. In addition, there are other pieces of information that are strictly confidential, and those include the Texas driver's license or social security number. In addition, Battleground Texas has made a decision not to collect phone number information. And, I'll be honest with you, there are lots of arguments that it is completely legal to collect this information. And in fact, there was an investigation about a year ago, and a bipartisan group in San Antonio found that there was no problem collecting phone numbers. That being said, because it is a gray area of the law, and because we are very, very, very careful in everything having to do with voter registration, it is our policy not to collect phone number information. That being said, what I just said referred to taking a registration form and taking information off of it. If you have any sort of separate piece of paper, like a count me in card, or a sticky note, or any sort of other sign-in sheet, and a voter gives you their name and contact information, it's completely fair game.
And I will say on that, we have plans this summer to get what are essentially CMI cards out into the field, so we can start collecting that information. Another thing that we're doing is tightening up the process by which we have, by which that information comes back from the Secretary of State into the van, so that we can do follow-up voter contact with folks that we register this year. So we will start collecting later this year using separate mechanisms like a count me in card, and we will do voter contact with folks that we've registered. Cool.
Great question.
Great question. Other questions? Press 1 or type it into the Google Hangout. Oh, we got another one from Gerald. All right, Gerald, you're up again, man.
Well, this is a question, something that I've been, this is something you've been trying to pass or whatever. Like the election judge, basically, after the whole thing's over, basically, one of the election official drops the memory card off to a drop-off point. That's the way they told us we did the test. But I think if there's no way to make it so it's required by law to have it that both election officials drop that material off the vote to the, I guess, drop-off point, that's something I think is reasonable,
I don't think I 100% understood your question. Are you saying that these are drop-off points for voter registration forms, or are they drop-off points for other election materials?
It's a drop-off point for election officials after the election's over. There's like a little memory card, whatever. There's some type of drop-off. Right now, they told us that the deciding judge is only the one who does that. I was wondering if there's a way we could hopefully get the protest situation which is required by law that those election officials are required to drop it off together.
Oh, it's very interesting. You know, I will have to double check, but I mean, you know, I obviously there could be a law passed, but I actually think that a poll watcher might be able to accompany the election judge in doing that. So maybe if there's a place where you're particularly concerned that there could be misconduct, we should talk about it and perhaps get a poll watcher there.
Yep.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Gerald. We have another question from Kim Hawkins. Kim? Oh, you might be muted on your side, Kim. We have you unmuted here.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, you're good.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
got you.
This may have already come up, and I'm on a cell phone because I didn't remember to use a landline. And I know you kind of brought up something similar. Is it legal for us to take mail-in registration forms to the post office and put them in the mailbox?
You know what? It's a great question. I don't think that I explicitly addressed that. No, VDRs are only allowed to turn in registration forms in person. And so, you know, you can never put a registration form into the mail. And I know that that's you know, especially for those of you who have ever done voter registration in other states, I know that that's a big difference. And I mean, truly, it's probably not legal, but it is Texas's law, so we need to follow it.
That's a great question.
Could I follow up with another one?
Sure.
Yep.
If somebody is not a VDR and say like you're at a block party and somebody's very interested in all of this, should they take the mail-in registration form for their friends to the post office?
No. And this is another great question, but in Texas, to touch the completed voter registration form of another person who is not a close family member, you have to be VDR'd. And then once you're VDR'd, you can only submit those forms in person to the county. So the best thing for you to do, if you are in a situation where, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're at a voter registration drive and somebody comes and they say, and you're in San Antonio, and somebody comes up and says, hey, I'm visiting from El Paso. Can you register me to vote? You would say no, assuming you're only VDR'd in Bexar County. And you know, and unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to help that person. You could give them a mail-in form and instruct the voter himself or herself to put it in the mailbox. But you know, unfortunately, nobody else can take that form.
Great.
But great question. These are all great questions.
Thank you, Kim. Great. So I'm gonna put one last call up for questions. And while we're waiting for folks, you can press 1 or you can type it into the Google Hangout. While we're waiting for folks, I will say after this, I'm going to send a follow-up email to all of the region leads and everyone who's on the phone, which will include a link to this recorded webinar so you can come back and reference it. It'll also include a link to where our voter registration resources are on the Battleground website. As Mimi mentioned, there's several videos on there and resources for you to reference. And I will also include a link to the new voter registration form, which can be downloaded and printed and utilized in any county.
And you know what? We'll also go ahead and send you the text of the advisory that the county sent, that the state sent out to the counties, just in case any of the counties have problems with the new form or they didn't read the advisory very carefully. Then you'll have that to show them as a reminder.
Looks like we've got one last question from Kim. Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, when you post this online, do you do it in such a real clear and easy process for people to find out how they can contact their representatives to push for the online registration. You mentioned talking to our friends. I just think that's really important, and I think the more we talk about it, the more people are going to say, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
You know, Kim, I love where your mind is. Because Battleground has made a decision that it's not going to lobby this term, that is actually considered lobbying. So, you know, instead, I'm just going to, you know, repeat what I said before, that, you know, I think that all of you in your individual capacities should keep an eye out on this, and you can find out more information. I know that there's a, you know, if you Google it, there have been other people putting up websites, and there's some information at the Texas Legislature's website as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, with that, it looks like we've got all of our questions answered for the evening. We'll go ahead and send out that follow-up email. And of course, if you have any additional questions, until we get the question function form on our website, please feel free to email myself or Mimi with specific questions or concerns about voter registration. Thank you all for being on the call tonight. And I think that's it.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Great.